Montana Territory, July 1881. The sun had barely crested the hills when Delaney North was handed her bedroll and told to leave. No raised voices, no insults, just a few cold looks and the foreman's flat words. "We don't need dead weight. You do not speak, you do not fit. Go." She did not argue. Delaney had never argued. She gathered her things with quiet hands and walked down the dusty path away from the Bar H Ranch, her boots stirring up the summer dirt. She had been there only 3 weeks, feeding chickens, mending torn grain sacks, scrubbing the wood floors of the bunkhouse. She did what was asked, never more, never less, but her silence unsettled them. The ranch owner's wife had whispered it first, a low comment passed during supper. "That girl's not right, not a word, like a ghost." That was all it took. Delaney kept walking, her satchel slung over one shoulder, her hat tugged low. No plans, no place to go, just the ache in her chest and her quiet. She had carried both most her life. By dusk, her feet were blistered and the prairie wind had picked up. She found a dry patch beneath a cluster of cottonwoods and curled up, listening to the rustle of branches above her and the distant howl of coyotes. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but she closed her eyes, willing the night to pass. She did not see the rider until morning when the clop of hooves broke her uneasy sleep. She sat up fast, brushing hair from her eyes. A tall man on horseback slowed as he spotted her. His horse, a roan gelding, snorted once and stopped. He looked down at her for a long moment. "You hurt?" he asked. Delaney shook her head. "You lost." She hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. He studied her face. His voice was quiet but steady. "Name's Yates Granger. I got a small place about 5 miles west. You can ride with me if you want. Or I can bring water, food, then be on my way. Up to you." Delaney stood slowly, brushing off her skirt. She did not speak, did not trust her voice, but she stepped forward and he reached down a gloved hand to help her up behind him. They rode in silence. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her cheek brushing the back of his worn shirt. He smelled like leather and cedar smoke. The cabin sat in a valley surrounded by pine and rock, tucked far from the beaten cattle trails. There was a corral, a smokehouse, and a half-built barn. 2 goats wandered near the porch, and a lean dog lifted his head as they rode in. Yates dismounted with ease, then turned to help her down. "You can stay here a bit. I do not get many visitors." Delaney followed him inside. The cabin was clean, sparse. A rifle hung on the wall. A kettle steamed on the stove. He set out bread and cold beans, and she sat at the table, hands folded on her lap. He watched her a moment, then said, "You do not have to speak. Just know your silence is safe here." Her eyes lifted. For the first time in days, something inside her loosened. She stayed. The first days were quiet. Yates rose early, working the land, mending fence, tending his animals. Delaney helped where she could, washing clothes in the creek, sweeping the porch, cooking simple meals. She still said nothing, but he did not push. He talked sometimes small things, weather, crops, the way his mule hated rain. She listened. One afternoon, as she scrubbed a pot outside, he came over with a gentle look. "You got folks?" She shook her head. "I figured." He paused. "Me neither. Folks died when I was 16. Been on my own ever since." She looked up at him then, the sun catching the green in her eyes. He smiled, not asking anything more. That evening after supper they sat on the porch. The sky burned orange, the air soft with summer. Yates handed her a cup of coffee and their fingers touched. She did not pull away. Days turned. She began to hum while she worked, soft, low tunes. He never asked her to stop. One morning, a rider came up the trail, a neighbor from 3 valleys over. "Storm hit my place," the man said. "Roof came down, hurt my arm. Need help moving stock." Yates stood, already reaching for his hat. "I will come." Delaney stepped forward. I can come too." Her voice cracked from disuse. Yates looked at her, startled, but only nodded once. They rode together, side by side. She did not speak again that day, but the sound of her voice lingered in his chest like a brand. That night, after the work was done and they returned home, Yates built a fire. Delaney sat close, her knees drawn up. He handed her a blanket. "You surprised me today," he said quietly. She looked at him, then away, her cheeks pink. Not just the voice, he added. The way you rode out, the way you helped that man, you are strong, Delaney. She looked back at him, then eyes wide, the firelight dancing in them. I do not feel strong. You are, he said. You are just quiet about it. She stared at him a long moment. Then she reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. He turned his palm to hers, holding it gently. The silence between them was warm now, and she stayed. The first frost came early that year, dusting the porch rail and stiffening the creek's edge by dawn. Delaney stood at the window, arms folded tight across her chest, watching Yates split wood in the yard. His coat hung open, breath fogging as he worked, shoulders steady with each swing. She'd never seen anyone move without waste. He noticed her watching and lifted one hand, not a wave, just a simple acknowledgement. She pressed her palm to the window pane in return. Later, when he came in, she set a tin cup of warmed cider on the table without a word. He took it, fingers grazing hers. You ever live through a Montana winter? He asked, settling onto the bench beside the stove. She shook her head. Well, he said, they'll make you believe in the hard parts of God. Wind never quits howling. Snow'll come up past your knees some days. But it's quiet, clean in its own way. He glanced over at her. I figure you might like that. Delaney traced the rim of her own cup, her lips parting slightly. I think I might. Yates smiled, not wide but warm. Then you'll stay. She looked at him a long moment, then nodded once. It wasn't hesitation. It was weight. A kind of choice that set down roots. By mid-November, they'd fallen into a rhythm built around necessity and unspoken agreement. She patched a thick wool shirt he tore on a fence post. He added cedar planks to the eastern wall of the cabin to keep the wind from seeping in. When she began baking cornbread in the cast iron Dutch oven, he didn't say a word, just ate every last crumb. One morning, as the sun edged over the ridge, she found him in the lean-to behind the barn, oiling the rifle. She stood in the doorway until he looked up. You shoot? He asked. She stepped inside and nodded. He handed it over. Let's see. They walked out past the paddock where the snow lay thin but crusted. He set up 3 cans on a split rail. She took a breath, sighted, and hit the first one clean through. The second wobbled but stayed upright. The third she missed. Yates watched her lower the rifle. You're steady. Most folks flinch. She lowered her eyes. My father taught me before everything changed. Yates didn't push. I'm glad he did. That night she pulled out a worn piece of muslin and began stitching by lamplight. Yates sat nearby, whittling a piece of pine into something shapeless but calming. He spoke after a while. There's a woman buried out in the clearing, my mother. I set stones there but never carved her name. Couldn't bring myself to. Delaney looked up. She was good with her hands like you. Used to mend my shirts with thread she dyed herself. Birch bark and walnut husks. Always said you could tell a person's soul by the way they held a needle. Delaney set her sewing down carefully. Would you like me to carve her name? He was quiet a long time before answering. Only if you want to. The next afternoon, she took his chisel and a flat piece of pine and sat by the stones. She did not rush. Her hands were deliberate, her strokes clean. When she was finished, she brought the board to him. He ran his fingers over the letters. Thank you. Delaney didn't speak. She didn't need to. Winter deepened. The snow piled high on the roof. She began wearing his old coat over her shoulders, the sleeves too long but warm. He never mentioned it. One evening, as the wind tore through the trees and the fire popped in the hearth, Yates poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her. You ever think about building something? Long-term, I mean. A place that's yours? She looked up, thoughtful. I used to, she said, voice soft but steady. Before I stopped believing I'd be welcome anywhere. He studied her face, his brow drawn but gentle. You're welcome here. She held his gaze. I know. He reached across the table, not bold, not urgent, just a hand, open and waiting. She laid hers in his. That night, she didn't return to the cot by the stove. Instead, she followed him up the narrow loft ladder and lay beside him beneath the thick wool blankets. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In the darkness, he reached for her hand again. She laced her fingers through his, and finally, Delaney slept without waking. The snow held. For weeks, it blanketed the land in a hush that pressed against the windows and softened the sound of boots on the porch. Inside, the cabin grew smaller, not for lack of space, but because of how closely they learned to live beside each other. Yates spent his mornings repairing harness leather by lantern light or checking the roof for weak spots. Delaney trimmed the wick in the oil lamp each evening and wrapped the kitchen shelves in old flour sackcloth to keep the cold from curling into the food. Their days moved slow but steady, bound by the rhythm of care. One afternoon, she sat at the table sharpening a paring knife. The edge had dulled from use, and she ran the whetstone over it with even strokes. Yates watched her from the doorway, his coat dusted with frost. "You always work like you're preparing for something," he said. Delaney didn't pause. "I am," his brow lifted. "What do you think's coming?" She set the blade down. "Something always comes." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "You've been alone too long if that's the only truth you trust." She looked toward the fire. "I've never known another." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he drew up a chair, his weight settling into the wood. "I used to think the same. After my brother drowned, I stopped expecting folks to stay. I just figured if I didn't ask for much, nothing could be taken." Delaney looked at him fully. "You had a brother?" His jaw moved once before he answered. "Caleb, 2 years older, couldn't swim worth a damn but thought he could. River took him before the thaw." She nodded slowly. "My sister died of fever. I was 14. She was the only one who ever understood the sound of quiet." Yates leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "What was her name?" "Anna." They sat with that. The wind outside shifted, dragging snow against the shutters like a slow hand. Neither spoke again until the kettle hissed. As evening settled, Delaney took up the carving knife and a block of pine. She didn't say what she was making, just set to work with a focus that pulled her into silence deeper than usual. Yates cleaned out the ashes from the stove, casting glances her way but not interrupting. By the time the stew was ready, she had shaped the beginnings of a cradle, simple, rough-edged but unmistakable in form. He came to stand beside her. "That for someone else?" "No," she said, not looking up. "It's for what might be." Yates didn't touch the wood. "You think that's what we are now?" "A might be." Delaney turned to face him, her hand still resting on the unfinished curve of the cradle's side. "I think I want to build something that lasts, with someone who sees me." His voice was quieter now. "I see you." They stood across from each other, the stove ticking behind them, the cradle between. Delaney reached out, not to the carving, but to him. She touched his chest, just above his heart, and left her hand there. "I've been still most of my life," she said. "But I don't want to be still anymore." Yates covered her hand with his. "Then don't be." Later they lay awake in the loft, her head tucked beneath his chin, his arm around her waist. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, something else had taken root. When morning came, she rose first. She folded his shirt from the end of the bed and set it near the stove to warm. He watched her from the ladder, eyes soft. "You planning something?" he asked. She tied her hair back with a strip of linen. "I want to plant potatoes come spring." "We'll need to clear the slope by the creek," he smiled slowly. She met his gaze. "Yes." He crossed the room, kissed her forehead, and said, "Then let's get to it." By late February, the ground was still frozen, but the sky had begun to stretch longer into evening, and a warmth crept into the wind that hadn't been there since autumn. Delaney stood at the edge of the south ridge, boots braced in old snow, studying the slope that caught the most light. She held a scrap of charcoal and a piece of flour paper, sketching the lines of where she'd plant come thaw. Her notes were spare, the kind of quiet planning that had always lived in her hands instead of her voice. Yates approached behind her, the sound of his step distinct in the crusted snow. He didn't call out, just came to stand beside her, glancing at the paper without reaching for it. "You thinking rows or mounds?" he asked. "Rows," she answered. "If we terrace them a little along the incline, it'll keep the runoff from washing out the roots." He nodded once. There's a woman I knew in Miles City used to swear by planting beans beside potatoes. Said they watched each other's backs. Delaney folded the paper and tucked it into her coat. Then we'll do that. They walked back slowly, the sun lowering behind them. The air smelled faintly of pine pitch and meltwater. Inside, the fire had burned low and the cabin was quiet in the way that invited thought. Yates stirred the coals, added a pine knot, then sat with his elbows on his knees watching the flames catch. "You ever miss the sound of people?" he asked. Delaney leaned against the table, arms folded. "Not the sound, sometimes the presence." He looked up. "I think that's why I kept the dog around, doesn't say much but fills the space," she half smiled. "He's the only one you let sleep under the bed," Yates shrugged. "He earned it, pulled me out of the river once when I slipped through the ice. Nearly froze doing it." Delaney's expression shifted. "You never told me that." "I don't tell most folks the parts where I got careless." She stepped forward, her voice softer now. "I don't think you're careless." He reached for her hand, slow, like he didn't want to startle whatever had just opened between them. "I've been thinking on spring," he said, "about more than planting." Delaney didn't pull away. "Tell me." "I've got enough lumber stored in the lean-to build a new room, was saving it for a workshop, but I'd rather turn it into something useful." She waited. "A real bedroom," he said. "With a door that closes, a place that's shared, not borrowed." Delaney's fingers tightened around his. "You're not just saying that because winter's been kind to us." He shook his head. "I'm saying it because I want to build something that doesn't depend on the season." She nodded once. "Then let's start with the frame when the ground softens." The next morning, they rode out to the edge of the property, where the half-frozen creek split around a stand of birch. Yates carried a hatchet, Delaney a spool of twine and a small notebook. They marked the trees that would be thinned first, straight trunks, not too young, not too dry. She tied twine around each one, her gloves stiff from old sap. At one tree she paused. "This one," she said, "feels wrong." Yates stepped beside her. "Too close to the hill. Might cause erosion if we take it." She looked at him. "You always listen like that." He tilted his head. "Like what?" "Like the land has something worth saying." He gave her a long look. "Only when I'm lucky enough to hear it." They returned as the sun dipped low, their shadows long across the snow. That evening, Delaney brought out a new strip of muslin and began stitching something small. Yates watched from the hearth. "What's that one for?" She didn't look up. "Curtain for the new bedroom." He smiled, slow and sure. "Then I'll start cutting lumber tomorrow." She set the fabric down, walked to him, and rested her forehead against his. "I've never known anything to grow steady before." Yates drew her into his arms. "Then let's keep building it, one board at a time." By early April, the creek had begun to run full and quick again, dragging winter's silence out with it. The thaw pulled scent from the earth, mud, old pine, the faint sweetness of last year's grass returning to itself. Delaney stood in the doorframe, sleeves rolled past her elbows, watching Yates drive the final nail into the frame of what would be their new room. He straightened, brushing sawdust from his shirt. "We'll be ready for roof beams by week's end." Delaney stepped outside, her fingers still damp from rinsing lentils. "I sketched a layout for the shelves. Thought we might put them near the window. That way we'll see the ridge even on cold mornings." Yates set the hammer down. "That sounds right." They walked the perimeter together, her hand trailing the fresh-cut planks. The room wasn't large, but it opened outward in a way that felt like promise. "I was thinking," he said, pausing near the corner post, "about building a second rain barrel near the kitchen wall. Might help with the washing once planting starts." Delaney nodded. "I can stitch a cover for it. Keep the silt out." There was ease in the way they worked now, like each idea found its shape in the other's hands. That night after supper, Yates reached into the cabinet and pulled out a narrow tin box. He set it on the table, careful, as if it carried more than weight. "My father gave me this," he said, "when I turned 20. Told me to keep something in it worth remembering." Delaney leaned forward as he opened it. Inside lay a folded square of yellowed paper, an old silver ring, and a tiny, smooth stone with a crack down the middle. He held up the ring. It was my mother's. She wore it until the day she died. Never took it off, even when her fingers swelled. Delaney watched the way he turned it between his fingers, light catching on the worn edge. "I've kept it all this time," he said. "Didn't know what for, not until you." Her breath caught, but she didn't speak. "I want you to have it," he said. "Not because it's expected, because it's right, if you'll stay, if you'll marry me." She looked at the ring, then at him. "I never thought I'd be asked, not as I am." "You're exactly as I hoped," he said. She reached for the ring, her hands steady. "Then yes." They didn't speak again for a while. He drew her close, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the quiet thump of his heart, steady as the land beneath them. 3 weeks later, they stood before the ridge, just the two of them, with the dog lying nearby and the creek rushing behind. Delaney wore a pale blue dress she'd mended herself, the hem stitched with careful hands. Yates had shaved, though the cut on his chin still bled a little. He held her hands in his. "I've never had a place feel like home," she said, voice low. "Until here." "I've never had someone choose to stay," he answered, "but I'll keep showing up every morning until you don't have to wonder." They sealed it with a kiss, soft and sure. Summer came in with long light and warm earth. Delaney's potatoes sprouted strong, the bean vines curling upward just like she planned. She hung the curtain in their new room, pale against the log walls, and filled the shelves with folded cloth and dried herbs. Yates built her a table by the eastern window. She ran her fingers along the joints and said, "You've got a way with corners." He grinned. "You've got a way of making them feel like beginnings." She planted lavender by the porch. He taught her how to trap for mink without harming the pines. They took the wagon into town only twice, once for sugar and nails, once for salt and a comb with a bone handle. No one asked where she'd come from. No one needed to. That autumn, she carried their first child beneath her apron, and the cradle sat finished in the corner, lined with wool she'd carded herself. The leaves turned slow that year, gold holding long into October. One evening, as they sat by the stove and the dog stretched out across the floor, Yates reached for her hand. "You ever think we got lucky?" he asked. "No," she said. "I think we chose right." Outside, the wind stirred but didn't bite. Inside, the fire burned low and warm. And they stayed, side by side, through each season that followed, loving, building, and growing quiet as the land itself, bound not by fear or need, but by the deep, steady knowing that they belonged.